This is a private park. Those words, spat out on a peaceful morning in Maple Heights, would ignite a firestorm that no one saw coming. When Karen Whitfield confronted a well-dressed black man on her morning walk, she thought she was protecting her exclusive community. She had no idea she was about to become the face of everything wrong with suburban America, or that redemption would come from the most unexpected places. "What are you doing here? This is a private park." Karen Whitfield's voice cut through the peaceful morning air like a razor. Her designer yoga pants and perfectly styled blonde hair seemed at odds with the venom in her tone. She clutched her small Maltese closer to her chest as she glared at the man sitting on the park bench, his suit jacket folded neatly beside him. David Marshall looked up from his phone, already familiar with this particular dance. 20 years as a black man in corporate America had taught him exactly how these encounters typically played out. He took a slow, deliberate breath before responding. "Good morning," he said calmly, making sure to keep his hands visible and his tone measured. "I'm just taking a moment to enjoy the sunrise before heading to work." "This park is for residents only," Karen insisted, taking a step back despite the considerable distance between them. Her free hand was already reaching for her phone. "I know everyone who lives in Maple Heights, and you're not one of them." David fought the urge to laugh at the irony. He'd actually purchased his home in Maple Heights 3 months ago, but between the campaign and the transition, he'd barely had time to unpack, let alone socialize with the neighbors. "Ma'am, I assure you I'm a resident," he said, still maintaining his composed demeanor. "I moved in recently, to the Thompson house on Oak Street." "The 5-bedroom Victorian?" Karen scoffed. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England. I'm calling the police." As she began dialing, David noticed other morning park-goers slowing down to watch the confrontation. A jogger pulled out her phone, likely recording. An elderly man walking his dog shook his head sadly, but said nothing. A young mother steered her children toward a different path. "Before you make that call," David said quietly, "you might want to check yesterday's news." But Karen was already speaking into her phone. "Yes, hello? There's an unauthorized person in Maple Heights Park. He's making me feel unsafe." She paused, looking David up and down. "Yes, he's black, wearing a suit. Yes, I'll hold." David sighed and reached for his jacket. As he did so, Karen took another dramatic step backward. "Don't move! The police are on their way." "Actually," came a new voice, "they're not." Both David and Karen turned to see an older woman approaching, her silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. Patricia Chen had been on the Maple Heights Community Board for 30 years, and her reputation for no-nonsense leadership was legendary. "I just got off the phone with dispatch," Patricia continued, holding up her own phone. "I explained that there's been a misunderstanding involving our new mayor." The color drained from Karen's face as Patricia's words sank in. Her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering on the brick pathway. "Mayor?" she whispered. "David Marshall," he said, standing and extending his hand with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was sworn in yesterday. You might have missed the ceremony. It was rather well attended." Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, no sound emerging. Her Maltese, sensing the shift in energy, began squirming in her arms. I didn't know," David finished for her. "That's rather the point, isn't it? You saw a black man in your park and made immediate assumptions about whether he belonged here. The fact that I'm the mayor doesn't make those assumptions any less problematic. It just makes them more obviously wrong." Patricia stepped forward, her expression stern. "Karen, this isn't the first time your vigilance has caused issues in the community. Remember the incident with the Hispanic landscapers last summer? Or the time you called security on those Asian college students who were studying by the fountain?" "I was just trying to keep our neighborhood safe," Karen protested weakly. "Safe from what?" David asked, his voice gentle but firm. "From anyone who doesn't look like you? From change? From the reality that diversity makes communities stronger, not weaker?" He picked up his jacket and briefcase. "I have a meeting at City Hall in 30 minutes, but I'd like to continue this conversation. Perhaps we could schedule a community forum to discuss what making Maple Heights truly safe and welcoming for everyone might look like." Patricia's eyes lit up. "Actually, the community board meeting is tonight. Would you consider addressing this incident there? It might be a perfect catalyst for some long overdue discussion." David nodded, checking his watch. "I'll be there. Karen, I hope you'll join us too. Change starts with difficult conversations." As David walked away, heads turned to follow his progress through the park. The jogger who had been recording was already typing frantically on her phone. By noon, the video would be viral, and Maple Heights would find itself at the center of a national conversation about privilege, prejudice, and power. But the real story was just beginning. By 6 o'clock that evening, the Maple Heights Community Center was packed well beyond its usual capacity. The video of the morning's confrontation had exploded online, with Thrash Mayor in the park trending nationally. News vans lined the street outside, and reporters jostled for position near the entrance. Inside, Karen sat in the back row, her usual confident demeanor notably absent. She'd changed out of her yoga wear into a conservative blue dress, as if proper attire could somehow erase the morning's events. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from friends who'd seen the video, some expressing sympathy, others distancing themselves from her action. Patricia Chen called the meeting to order, but the usual municipal discussions about parking regulations and garden club funding were clearly not what the overflow crowd had come to hear. When David Marshall finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying the same measured calm it had held that morning. "I hadn't planned to begin my mayoral term with a discussion about racial profiling, but sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we don't plan." He paused, scanning the room. "This morning's incident in the park wasn't about me. If I hadn't been the newly elected mayor, if I'd just been another black professional trying to enjoy a moment of peace before work, would that have made Ms. Whitfield's actions any more acceptable?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. In her seat, Karen seemed to shrink further into herself. "I've read some of the online comments about the video," David continued. "Many people are calling for Ms. Whitfield to be censured, fined, or even forced to move. But punitive measures don't address the root cause of what happened this morning. They don't challenge the assumptions that lead someone to see a man in a suit sitting on a park bench and immediately perceive a threat." He turned to directly address Karen. "Ms. Whitfield, would you be willing to come up here and share your perspective?" The room tensed. Karen looked like she might be sick, but after a moment's hesitation, she stood. Her legs trembled as she made her way to the podium. David stepped aside, offering her the microphone. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I've lived in Maple Heights for 15 years. When I moved here, it was because I wanted somewhere safe to raise my daughter as a single mother. This community became my sanctuary." She gripped the podium tighter. "But I realize now that what I saw as protecting our community was really about maintaining my own comfort at the expense of others. When I saw Mr. Marshall, Mayor Marshall, in the park this morning, I didn't see a neighbor. I didn't see a professional. I didn't see a father who probably chose Maple Heights for the same reasons I did. I saw a threat, and that says something about me, not about him." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now. "I'm sorry, not just for this morning, but for all the times I've made others feel unwelcome in their own community. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to learn." David stepped forward again, standing beside her at the podium. "That's where we start, not with shame or defensiveness, but with honesty and a willingness to learn." He addressed the room again. "I'm establishing a community relations task force, effective immediately. We'll be looking at everything from police training to school curricula to housing policy. But we're also going to be having a lot of uncomfortable conversations about privilege, prejudice, and what it really means to be a community." Patricia Chen raised her hand. "The community board would be honored to help facilitate these discussions, Mayor Marshall. And I think we need to acknowledge our own role in allowing these incidents to continue unchallenged for so long." A young black woman stood up from the middle of the room. "My name is Aisha Washington. I've lived here for 3 years, and I can't count the number of times I've been stopped, questioned, or made to feel unwelcome. Will this task force include voices like mine, people who've experienced this treatment firsthand?" "Absolutely," David nodded. "In fact, I'd like you to co-chair it, Ms. Washington. Along with..." He turned to Karen. "Ms. Whitfield, would you be willing to serve as well?" The room erupted in murmurs again. Karen looked startled. "Me? But after what I did, sometimes the people who have the most to learn also have the most to teach others who share their perspectives," David explained. "Your journey from this morning to this evening, that's valuable, that's real, and it might help others confront their own biases." As the meeting continued into the night, no one left their seats. Person after person stood to share their experiences, both as victims of profiling and as people confronting their own prejudices. The local news crews kept their cameras rolling, capturing something far more compelling than a simple viral confrontation: the messy, difficult, necessary work of a community trying to change. But outside the community center, another story was unfolding. The national media descended on Maple Heights like a storm. Cable news pundits debated the incident endlessly, their interpretations falling predictably along partisan lines. Some praised Mayor Marshall's approach as a masterclass in transformative justice, while others accused him of being too soft, arguing that Karen's actions deserved harsher consequences. Karen's life changed overnight. Her real estate business suffered as clients quietly took their business elsewhere. Her daughter, away at college, called in tears after her roommates recognized Karen in the viral video. Even her Maltese's dog walker sent a polite email terminating her service. But it was the unexpected show of support from Aisha Washington that began to shift the narrative. My initial reaction was anger, Aisha admitted during their first task force meeting held in the library's community room. But watching Ms. Whitfield's speech at the community board meeting, I saw something familiar. The fear she described, the desire to protect what's hers. I recognize that. The difference is, my fear comes from being excluded, while hers comes from losing privilege she didn't even realize she had. Karen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I've been doing a lot of reading since that morning, about white privilege, about systemic racism. I keep thinking about all the times I called the police or complained to security, never considering how my actions could have ruined someone's life. David, who had insisted on attending despite his packed mayoral schedule, leaned forward. That's why this task force is so important. We're not here to shame or punish. We're here to understand and transform. Now, let's talk about concrete steps. Over the next few weeks, the task force began implementing changes. They started small, revising the park's residents-only policy, which had historically been used to discriminate. They organized Coffee with Your Neighbors events, encouraging genuine connections across racial and social boundaries. They launched a community history project, documenting both the overt and subtle ways Maple Heights had maintained its exclusive character over the decades. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. During one particularly heated task force meeting, an elderly resident stood up and voiced what others had been whispering. "This is all well and good," he declared, "but property values in Maple Heights have dropped 15% since this whole incident went viral. We're becoming known as the racist suburb. Is this really the legacy we want?" Before David could respond, Karen surprised everyone by speaking up. "2 months ago, I would have agreed with you. Property values were my god. But let me ask you something. What's worth more? The market value of our homes or the moral value of our community?" The room fell silent. Karen continued, her voice growing stronger. "I lost clients because of what I did. My reputation is in tatters. But I've gained something too. For the first time in my life, I'm part of building something meaningful instead of just protecting what I have." Aisha reached over and squeezed Karen's hand, a gesture that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. The task force's work began attracting attention from other communities facing similar challenges. David found himself fielding calls from mayors across the country, all asking the same question. How do you turn a moment of conflict into an opportunity for genuine change? But it was a small incident 6 months later that showed how much Maple Heights had begun to transform. A new black family was moving into the neighborhood, unloading their moving truck on a Saturday morning. Karen happened to be walking her dog past their house. Instead of eyeing them suspiciously or calling anyone, she walked up to their front yard. "Welcome to Maple Heights," she said, extending her hand to the startled couple. "I'm Karen Whitfield. Would you like help unpacking? And please join us for coffee with your neighbors next Saturday. We'd love to get to know you." Later that evening, she received a text from David. "Saw you with the new neighbors today. That's how change happens, one interaction at a time." But even as Maple Heights was changing, larger forces were at work that would test their progress in ways no one could have anticipated. The first challenge came in the form of a civil rights lawsuit. A group of former Maple Heights residents came forward, documenting decades of discriminatory practices in the community. Their stories stretched back years before Karen's viral moment. Rejected rental applications, suspicious police stops, hostile neighborhood watch program. David found himself in an impossible position. As mayor, he had a duty to protect the city's interests. But as a black man who had experienced discrimination firsthand, he understood the plaintiff's pain all too well. The lawsuit threatened to bankrupt the community and undo all the progress they had made. It was Aisha who proposed an unprecedented solution during an emergency task force meeting. "What if," she suggested, "instead of fighting this lawsuit, we embrace it? What if we create a community reconciliation fund, not just to compensate these specific plaintiffs, but to invest in making real, structural changes in Maple Heights?" Karen, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "I'll contribute the first donation. The commission from every house I sell in Maple Heights. Half goes to the fund." The idea snowballed. Other real estate agents followed Karen's lead. Local businesses pledged percentages of their profits. Longtime residents wrote checks, some small, some substantial. Even the elderly man who had complained about property values came forward with a significant contribution. But the most surprising support came from Patricia Chen, During a packed city council meeting, she stood up and made a shocking revelation. 30 years ago, when I joined the community board, she began, her voice shaking. One of my first actions was to quietly pressure the zoning commission to reject applications from minority-owned businesses. I told myself it was about maintaining the character of our community. I was wrong. Today I'm donating my entire retirement savings to the Reconciliation Fund. The room erupted in gasps. Patricia had always been seen as a pillar of the community. Her confession forced many longtime residents to confront their own complicity in Maple Heights' history of discrimination. The lawsuit eventually settled, but its impact rippled far beyond the financial settlement. The Reconciliation Fund became a model for other communities grappling with similar history. David was invited to speak at national conferences about transformative justice and community healing. Yet even as Maple Heights was being hailed as an example of positive change, new challenges emerged. A prominent conservative news channel ran a series of segments attacking the Reconciliation Fund as reverse racism and wealth redistribution. Death threats began arriving at City Hall. David's children needed security escorts to school. Karen, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for change, found her car vandalized with racial slurs, not against her, but attacking her work with the black community. The message was clear. Some saw her as a traitor to her race. During this tense period, Aisha organized a community dinner in the park, the same park where everything had started. Despite the threats and controversy, hundreds of residents showed up, bringing dishes that reflected their diverse cultural background. As the sun set over the park, David stood to address the crowd. But before he could speak, a group of protesters arrived carrying signs condemning the Reconciliation Fund and chanting about taking back Maple Heights. What happened next would once again put their community in the national spotlight. Karen stepped forward, positioning herself between the protesters and the gathering. She was trembling but determined. "I used to be you," she called out to them. "I used to think I was protecting something valuable by keeping others out. But look around this park tonight. Look at these families, these children playing together, these connections being made. This is what's valuable. This is what needs protecting." One of the protesters, a man with a red face and angry eyes, stepped toward her aggressively. "You're just trying to ease your white guilt," he sneered. "We've seen the video. You're no better than us. You're just a sellout now." "You're right about one thing," Karen replied calmly. "I'm no better than anyone. That's exactly what I've learned. But I am trying to be better than I was, and this community is becoming better than it was. You're welcome to join us. There's plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of opportunity to learn and grow together." The tension hung in the air for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, one of the younger protesters lowered his sign. Then another. Slowly, hesitantly, some of them accepted plates of food from community members who had stepped forward to offer them. Not all the protesters joined in. Some left, shouting threats and promises to return. But as the evening continued, the sound of their angry chants was drowned out by children's laughter, music, and the murmur of new conversations being started. As David watched this scene unfold, he realized something profound about the nature of change. Change, David realized, wasn't a single moment or even a series of moments. It was a continuous process of small choices compounding over time. Like a river slowly carving through stone, each individual action might seem insignificant, but together they could transform the landscape of an entire community. This insight would prove crucial in the months ahead, as Maple Heights faced its greatest challenge yet. The state legislature, responding to pressure from conservative activists, introduced a bill that would effectively outlaw community reconciliation funds like theirs, labeling them as discriminatory practices themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. David found himself traveling to the state capitol frequently, testifying before committees and meeting with legislators. But it was Karen who proved to be their secret weapon in these battles. Her transformation from viral video villain to passionate advocate for change made her story particularly compelling to lawmakers who might otherwise have dismissed the issue. "I was the woman who called the police on a black man for sitting in a park," she testified, her voice echoing through the marble halls of the state capitol. "I was the woman who made assumptions based on skin color. I was the woman who thought she was protecting her community by keeping others out, and I was wrong. This fund isn't about punishment or guilt. It's about healing and growth. If you outlaw that, You're not protecting communities, you're protecting prejudice. Her testimony went viral, just as the original part Confrontation had. But this time, Karen was prepared for the spotlight. She appeared on national news shows, wrote op-eds, and started a podcast about her journey from confrontation to reconciliation. Meanwhile, back in Maple Heights, Aisha was leading efforts to document the concrete impacts of their work. The data was compelling. Property values had not only recovered, but were now rising steadily. Crime rates had dropped. New businesses were opening, many owned by people of color who previously wouldn't have considered Maple Heights a viable location. The local schools were showing improved outcomes for all students, as an increased community engagement led to better resources and support for every child. But perhaps the most powerful evidence came in the form of small, daily interactions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Like the afternoon when a white resident's car broke down in front of the park, and without hesitation, they accepted help from their black neighbor. Or the day when a group of teenagers, white, Black, Asian, and Hispanic, organized a community cleanup project together. Or when Karen's daughter came home from college and remarked that Maple Heights felt more like a real home than it ever had before. Patricia Chen, who had been keeping meticulous records of the community's transformation, decided to write a book about their experience. She interviewed hundreds of residents, documenting not just the big moments that made headlines, but the countless small changes that had reshaped the community's DNA. One story particularly stood out. A new black family had moved into the house next door to where Karen lived. Their young son, about 8 years old, was playing in their front yard when his ball rolled onto Karen's property. The boy froze, clearly uncertain about retrieving it. His mother, who had seen the viral video, rushed out to intervene, but Karen was already coming out of her house. Instead of reacting with suspicion or anger, she picked up the ball, walked it over to the fence, and said, "You've got a good arm there. You know, we have a youth baseball league starting up in the park. Would you be interested in joining?" The boy's face lit up, while his mother fought back tears. Later, she would tell Patricia, "That's when I knew the stories about Maple Heights changing were real, when the woman from that video became the person who invited my son to play baseball." As these stories accumulate, they began to create a new narrative about what was possible when a community confronted its prejudices honestly and committed to real change. Other towns and cities started sending representatives to study the Maple Heights model. But David knew their work was far from complete. As he sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the latest draft of Patricia's book, he received a call that would force everyone in Maple Heights to decide just how committed they were to their transformation. The call came from the governor's office. The state was planning to build a new community college campus, and Maple Heights was being considered as a potential location. The catch? The college would primarily serve underprivileged communities from the surrounding areas, dramatically changing the demographic makeup of their town. "This is exactly what some residents feared," Patricia admitted during an emergency task force meeting. "They'll say we're becoming too accessible, that we're losing our character." She spoke the last word with pointed irony. Karen stood up. "Then let them say it. Let them leave if they want to, because the Maple Heights they're trying to preserve, that Maple Heights was built on exclusion and fear. I should know. I was its biggest defender." The debate raged for weeks. Property values again became a talking point. Traffic concerns were raised. Some residents argued that the college would change the character of the community, the same coded language that had been used for decades to maintain segregation. But this time was different. This time, when someone raised concerns about those people coming into their community, other residents stood up to challenge them. When anonymous flyers appeared warning about increased crime, the community responded by organizing information sessions about the economic benefits of education investment. The turning point came during the final town hall meeting before the vote. An elderly white resident, who had lived in Maple Heights for over 50 years, slowly made his way to the microphone. "I've been here longer than most of you," he began, his voice shaking. "I remember when this community was founded. I remember the real estate covenants that kept certain people out. I remember the whispered agreements and the pointed exclusion. And I remember teaching my children that this made us special, made us better." He paused, wiping his eye. "I was wrong. My generation was wrong. And now we have a chance to do better, to be better, to build something real, not just something exclusive." The vote to approve the college campus passed overwhelmingly. David signed the proposal with the same pen he'd used to establish the Reconciliation Fund. As cameras flashed, he caught Karen's eye in the crowd and saw his own emotions reflected there: pride, hope, and the sobering recognition that their work would never truly be finished. 5 years later, Maple Heights had transformed beyond recognition. The community college campus bustled with life. New businesses lined the streets. owned by people of all backgrounds. The park where it all began now hosted regular multicultural festivals, community events, and, yes, early morning moments of peace for anyone who wanted them. Karen had transformed too. She now taught a course at the community college on housing discrimination and community transformation. Her podcast had evolved into a nationally recognized platform for discussions about privilege, prejudice, and the possibility of change. She and Aisha had become close friends, their unlikely partnership a living testament to the power of confronting bias with courage and compassion. David served 2 terms as mayor before moving on to state politics, where he continued advocating for community-based approaches to addressing systemic racism. But he never forgot the morning in the park, the moment that sparked a revolution in his community. On the 10th anniversary of that confrontation, the community gathered in the park to dedicate a new monument. It wasn't a statue or a plaque, but rather a simple bench, the same one where David had been sitting that fateful morning. Beside it stood a sign that read, "Change begins here, where prejudice meets courage, where confrontation leads to conversation, where a moment becomes a movement. Sit, listen, learn, grow." As the dedication ceremony ended, people noticed something remarkable. Sitting on the bench together were 2 figures, David Marshall and Karen Whitfield, sharing a quiet conversation as the sun rose over their transformed community. The real story of Maple Heights wasn't just about a confrontation in a park, or even about the changes that followed. It was about the ongoing choice each person makes, every day, to either reinforce old barriers or help break them down. It was about the courage to admit when we're wrong, the strength to choose growth over comfort, and the wisdom to understand that true community isn't built by keeping people out, but by welcoming them in. As new residents continue to move into Maple Heights, they often ask about the bench in the park. The story gets told and retold, not as a cautionary tale of racism exposed, but as a testament to what's possible when people choose to transform their prejudice into purpose, their fear into hope, and their exclusion into embrace. And sometimes, early in the morning, you might still find David Marshall sitting on that bench, watching the sunrise. Only now, he's rarely alone, because in Maple Heights, everyone belongs.